Welcome to Module 8, Dubbing as Cultural Transfer. So in this module, we continue discussing issues related to audiovisual translation. Last module, we focused on subtitling, and in this module, we will focus instead of dubbing. We gave some definition about audiovisual translation and different kinds of audiovisual translation in the last module. In this module, I would like to focus instead, as the title says, on elements that are more related to culture and the power of translation within media products. So, first of all, I would like to remind you, and we already discussed some of these issues in the last module, that translation in film and television is more than a literal change from one language to another. And oftentimes, audiovisual translation should be considered as cultural adaptation. So this is the big objective and what I want to discuss today, showing you some evidence. So dubbing, just to remind what it is, dubbing allows for the insertion of a new soundtrack, often a synchronized translation of the original dialogue. And the adaptation that derives from dubbing is nothing but a bridge between different cultures. Now, if we look at dubbing in this way, we could almost talk about dubbing in terms of manipulation of a text. But how does this work? I mean, how does this manipulation is possible within audiovisual translation? Well, first of all, there are changes that can be made to the character's ethnicity and nationality, and we will see it specifically today with a analysis of The Nanny and The Simpsons. Regional accents can be used to identify characters and stereotypes. There are references that can be made to national advertisement and popular culture that, of course, need to be changed to make sense for the new audience, an audience that can recognize those references. There's a chance to recreate jokes and irony that are based on local and national stereotypes. And of course, and we will see this at the end of this module, there is also a chance through dubbing to censor the original text and adding or eliminating certain elements that might be problematic for the new audience. So I'm very excited to discuss television translation in this module because that was the focus of my dissertation project when I wrote my dissertation at UCLA, and it's also what I discuss in the book that you guys are reading for this class. So in my dissertation, I focused on the changes made to 3 American TV shows when they were translated into Italian. The 3 series are The Nanny, the Italian title is La Tata, The Simpsons, I Simpson, and The Sopranos, I Sopranos. Now, my project aimed to understand and analyze how media, and in particularly television, have learned how to manage, exploit, and transform cultural specificity as a common industrial practice in the era of global media commerce. What does it mean? Well, it means that I do not look at translation simply from a textual standpoint, but I look at translation as an essential part of industrial practices, of international distribution, and of course I look at also at the economic elements that are involved in audiovisual translation and in the sale and the exportation of certain products, certain TV series in this case, to a different market, a foreign market. Now, the general approach that I used in my book and in my project was to look at translation theory. And specifically, I look at the work of Professor Lawrence Venuti. So, according to Venuti, the translator in general, and he's not talking necessarily about television translation, he discusses translation in literature, but as a general practice, translators often have to choose between a domestic method, which means that the author, the translator, brings the author back home, meaning that the translator tries to make a text more understandable, more domestic for the new audience. And on the other hand, there is a foreignizing method, which means that the translator tends to include foreign elements that might send the audience abroad, that might invite the audience to consider elements that are different from the national elements that they are familiar with. So if we accept this method of translation as a methodology for the analysis of these texts, what I found is that The Nanny and the Simpsons and their translation into Italian were mostly based on the method of domestication, whereas the translation of The Sopranos presented a balance between domestication and foreignization. And I'm going to show you examples that prove this point. Now, I would like to start discussing The Nanny. The Nanny is a sitcom that premiered on CBS in the early 1990s, and it tells the story of a Jewish nanny, Fran Fine, whom you'll see in the picture, and how she starts working for a Broadway producer, a British Broadway producer. Now, what happens in the Italian version is that because Italian audiences are not particularly familiar with the Jewish American princess stereotype, the translator needed to find some solution that would transfer the stereotype related to the Jewish American princess characteristics to something that Italian audiences could identify and, of course, laugh about. So these are some of the changes that happen in the Italian version if we compare it to the US version. Her name is different. Fran Fine in the US version, Francesca Cacace in the Italian version. Her ethnicity is different. She's Jewish in the US version and Italian American in the Italian version. Her religion changes from Jewish to, of course, Catholic. And the origin, which are from Flushing, Queens in the US, are changed to southern Italy. Now, the new humor that is introduced in the translation of The Nanny plays with Italian stereotypes and finds a corresponding depiction of the Jewish New York whiner, which is the uneducated Southern Italian, that is easily recognizable and understandable to Italian spectators. So part of the reason why the show was successful is because it managed to recreate the humor, but changing the references that sort of created that humor. So the translation, or if you want to call it adaptation, created a series that, in spite of losing its major original comic elements, was still very successful within its new audience. And one of these examples is sort of visualized here. I tried to visualize the same sort of dramatic reaction of women that are both Jewish, at least stereotypically Jewish in Fran Fine, and stereotypically Southern Italian in this Dolce & Gabbana commercial. So this form of adaptation, which is probably a more accurate term than just translation, truly stands in the middle ground between a more traditional translation achieved through dubbing, but also a complete remake, which is able to change the show drastically. However, there were some problems with the translation of The Nanny, and the problems came in with the visual elements that were present in the show. Now, the problem specifically was that The Nanny, the show, presents many visual elements that are unequivocally related to Judaism and Jewish culture. So, while dubbing can change the text, it cannot change the visuals. And it was quite complicated. I did talk with the director of dubbing, and those episodes were particularly problematic. So one of the episodes that presented some issues for the translator was the wedding episode. At the end of the series, Fran actually manages to marry Mr. Sheffield, the Broadway producer. And the translator needed to come up with some solutions that are not always successful or sort of credible, but they did have to somehow address the problem of the visual Jewish elements present in the show.
C'è qui al mio fianco l'assessore Rosenthal in rappresentanza del sindaco.
If you read the chapter on The Nanny in my book, then, well, you should know what happened. But just to explain it briefly, the translator basically specified that the rabbi in the wedding scene was really a justice of the peace. As you can imagine, it was a solution that was not very credible for Italian audiences, but this was one of the situations where a translator had to come up with some solution because the rest of the show has no mention of her being Jewish. Now, if we move to The Simpsons, in my dissertation I posed some questions. And specifically, I was interested in looking at how does Italian TV translate, adapt, and reestablish the culturally specific stereotypes and irony of The Simpsons, recreating the show's ethnic multiplicity within Italy's borders. One of the characteristics of The Simpsons is that it really includes quite an ensemble of characters that present different stereotypes, different characteristics. So it wasn't, like in the case of The Nanny, a matter of translating one ethnicity into another ethnicity, but it was really a matter of translating a lot of different characters into corresponding characters for Italian audiences. Is the translation effective in recreating the success that the series has had in the United States? Or is the translation problematic in dealing with and reconfirming stereotypes? At the end of the day, The Simpsons' humor is highly based on ethnic stereotypes. So, recreating those stereotypes, does it make the series problematic? And I want to point out how this idea of adaptation is not limited to Italy. I mean, every country importing a foreign text tends to make changes that will allow the foreign text to be more successful at home. In the case of The Simpsons, we have a pretty clear example of this form of adaptation through translation in the debut of The Simpsons in the Arab world. The Simpsons debuted in the Arab world not until September 2005, and it was right before Ramadan. So there were certain cultural and religious elements that the translator needed to take into consideration because it was sort of the holiest month for Muslims. The show uses the original Simpsons animation, so visually it looks like The Simpsons, but the voices are dubbed into Arabic and the scripts have been adapted to make the show more accessible and acceptable to Arab audiences. You can click on this article and in the PowerPoint presentation that I posted on Blackbird Learn, and you can read the entire information about the adaptation of The Simpsons for the Arab world. But some of the elements, some of the changes, for example, include references to alcohol were changed, references to pork, bacon, and hot dogs, and numerous other themes have been deleted or significantly modified. So, for example, Homer does not drink beer, but it drinks soda. And all the references to sausages and pork, etc., were cut or eliminated. So you can see how the tendency to use dubbing to eliminate original elements and to include national and local elements is actually quite popular and certainly not limited to Italian television. What happened in the Italian adaptation of The Simpsons, or the Italian dubbed version of The Simpsons, was a process of regionalizing characters, meaning making characters specific, recognizable, according to different regional lines in Italy. So you can see how Otto, for example, had an accent from Milan, Carl had an accent from Venice, Fat Tony, sort of in relation to the mafia, had an accent from Sicily, the corrupted policeman Clancy, an accent from Naples. And so what the translator did was, once again, to transfer certain stereotypes that in America were related to specific representations, specific accents, to another set of representations that Italians could recognize. Another element that the Italian dubbing changed was the references to national ads and culture. For example, the Bazooka Joe comics in the US version was changed to a Maxi-Bon ice cream advertisement that people remembered. Or the reference to Miller Time was changed to a reference of a commercial for an Italian beer that, once again, Italians were familiar with. So you can see how even The Simpsons and The Simpsons translator chose a number of strategies to domesticate the text and to make it more recognizable, more familiar for Italian audiences. So both The Nanny and The Simpsons use these technique of domestication in their translation process. Well, I want to discuss now The Sopranos and how The Sopranos and The Sopranos translator chose, in certain cases, domestication, but there were certain episodes in which the translator opted for the opposite strategy, which means to foreignize, to make the content foreign for Italian audiences. Now, I did have some questions that I posed for The Sopranos as well, but those questions were slightly different from the questions that I posed for The Simpsons. So for The Sopranos, my questions were, how does Italian television translate and adapt stereotypes and irony about an ethnic group that portrays Italians and Italian Americans in a particularly negative light? In this case, we have a show with that uses stereotypes with which Italians are actually very familiar with. So differently from The Nanny, differently from The Simpsons, where some of the stereotypes might be unknown to Italians, The Sopranos definitely represents and portrays an ethnic group, Italians and Italian Americans, that of course Italians are very familiar with. But is there a problem in the representation that we see in that show? Is the translation effective in recreating the success the series had in the United States? I mean, The Sopranos has been praised as one of the best series, if not the best series that has come out. So was the series also popular among Italian audiences? And in this case, I have a similar question than The Simpsons, but is the translation, again, problematic in dealing with and reconfirming stereotypes? I'm going to show you an example from an episode of The Sopranos, Employee of the Month, where we can see an example of cultural translation achieved through dubbing.
Maron, look at this pair. How many Napolitans does it take to screw in a light bulb? There's only candles in Naples right now. The cardinal of the church controls that racket.
That's a good one.
You like it, you can have it. Use it on your paisans.
We don't have those bulb jobs. They don't translate.
Oh.
I wrote down the text, the original English text, because it might be a little hard to understand exactly what they're saying, but I want to make sure that every word is very clear. So the original US version has Ralphie talking with Tony and Furio. Furio, he's like Tony's bodyguard, and Furio is actually Italian. He's not Italian American. He came from Italy, and he speaks Italian. He is full-blood Italian. So Ralphie asked, how many Napolitan does it take to screw in a light bulb? There's only candles in Naples right now. The cardinals of the church control that racket. So it's a joke. Furio responds, oh, that's a good one. Ralphie then, you like it? You can have it. Use it on your paisanos. And that's the interesting part. Furio responds, we don't have those bulb jokes. They don't translate. Now, to me, this dialogue is very interesting because it makes the show very self-referential about translation. It makes two characters discussing how it might be problematic to translate this show, or any show for that matter, for a foreign audience. The problem, however, is that while Furio is mentioning, well, these jokes don't translate, well, the actual translator of the series had to make a decision about how to translate this supposedly untranslatable joke. So this is the way the Italian translator sort of dealt with this issue. I literally translated the Italian version, so imagine that this is told in Italian. Ralphie, how many Napolitans does it take to screw in a light bulb? No one. There are only candles in Naples. A cardinal controls that racket. So far it's pretty much the same. Furio, that's a really good one. Ralphie, if you like it, tell it to your paisans. That's where the translation and translators really brought in cultural elements. Furio answers, it doesn't work in Italy. You can't mess with the church. So a joke that was about the difficulties in translating it to a foreign audience becomes a joke about the church in Italy and how you cannot mess or you cannot make fun of it. But so if we go back to that original theory of translation and what I said about the fact that each translator usually chooses between a domesticating method and a foreignizing method, then my thesis about The Sopranos was that the translation of The Sopranos in Italy constantly balanced the familiar and the unfamiliar, bringing the text home when domestication was needed, like in the case of the light bulb joke, or making the text foreign when it became too controversial. If we consider that The Sopranos is a show about organized crime, and organized crime that is usually based in Italy or in Italian American settings, you can see how some of the perhaps Italian translator and Italian viewers might have a problem with certain representations. So I talked to the director of dubbing for The Sopranos, and I asked her, were there any changes that were required? And she said that really there was not that many changes that were required, but there was one specific that the TV executives commissioning the translation were very, very adamant about. So what she said to me is that the only change the Italian network imposed for the translation was to never pronounce the word mafia. Every time that some character would pronounce the word mafia in the original version, we have translated and adapted with organized crime, gangster, or bypass the problem with no translation at all. Now you can see how in this example, dubbing not only functions as cultural transfer, but it really brings in issues of censorship. This was a time in Italy where the prime minister was directly involved, possibly with connections with the mafia, and therefore the important network didn't want to deal too specifically and too directly with mafia and organized crime. So you can see how when it comes to dubbing, you really have a lot of options, from changes to characters, ethnicity, changes to humor, changes to national references, but also, and this is of course where dubbing might become problematic, you can censor the original text. So in conclusion, what have we learned and why should we care? I mean, why is it important that we consider dubbing as a form of cultural transfer? Well, first of all, because those who rewrite dialogue, so the translators, do not simply translate texts, but make a cultural translation for a new audience. In other words, they offer the new audience a new text. But also, we have to understand how TV translation, whether we like it or not, is really what makes international distribution possible. And I want to remind you what Marion Edwards, at the time vice president of Fox International Television, told me, that exportability influences the choice of a script over another by a network that eventually decides to produce it. So exportability is actually the number one factor considered by TV executives when deciding to produce any new show. So dubbing can at times make exportability easier for certain shows, sometimes through cultural transfer, sometimes unfortunately through censorship. So what I really wanted to discuss with you today, and I hope that we can continue the discussion in class, is really to show you some examples of how dubbing can go way beyond a simple literal translation and can truly offer new audiences a complete new text.